Hey everybody, it's Andrew, and in this episode of Engines of the Pere Marquette, we're going to be discussing the railroad's second largest locomotives, the SFs and SF-6s, one of the last steam giants and the second to last queen of the railway. So without further ado, let's get started. The 2-10-2 wheel arrangement came into existence in 1903 by the Santa Fe Railway. This became known as the Santa Fe type after the first railroad to use them. Locomotives of this type weren't popular until 1914, and from that year until 1920 when it began to decline thanks to high maintenance costs and counterbalance issues, 2,000 of these had been built and delivered to American railroads. From 1906 to 1917, the Pere Marquette Railway was struggling physically and financially and had been in two receiverships from 1906 to 1912, earning it the nickname of Poor Marquette. Despite these conditions, the railway continued to upgrade its fleet with new Pacifics for pulling passenger trains, as well as new Consolidations and Mikados for pulling freight trains. Between 1912 and 1917, the receivers managed to rehabilitate the railway out of despair with the help of more modern equipment, thus allowing the receivership to finally come to an end. 1918 was a good year for the Pere Marquette. By that time, its traffic had already been subjected to the rearment program and had shifted from the 1900s base of agriculture and forest productions to coal from offline locations as a primary function. The Class MK Mikados were great at pulling fast freights, but with those coal trains demanding more power and not being so focused on speed, the Pere Marquette needed a new, larger, and more powerful locomotive than the MKs for the job. The answer to this were the SF-class Santa Fe's, of which the PM had Alco build 15 of such numbered 1101 to 1115 in 1918. They immediately became the railway's new largest and most powerful locomotives, and they were the first in the fleet to have 10 driving wheels. SF was the Pere Marquette's form of classing the Santa Fe type, as it contained its initials. The locomotives were 81 feet long with their tenders and weighed 247 tons total. They had an adhesion factor of 4.12, a grade area of 66.8 square feet, a combined heating surface of almost 3,600 square feet, 26 by 32 inch cylinders, 57 inch driving wheels, 200 psi boilers, piston valves with Baker valve gear, and a tractive effort of 64,500 pounds. The first 8 locomotives had DuPont B stokers, and the rest had duplex D1s. The locomotives also had a superheater, obviously, and 9 RS tenders, which carried 15 tons of coal and 9,000 gallons of water. Although developed in the United States Railroad Administration's brief reign until 1920, the SFs were smaller than most American 210-2s, especially when compared to the USRA Light 210-2A. This is because they were designed in accordance to the Pere Marquette's main lines, which had low axle load and weight limits and severe bridge restrictions. Making them this small gave them as much route availability as possible, and also made the SFs the most unusual locomotives in the Pere Marquette's fleet. In addition to the locomotive, the tenders were also very small, so small that the coal bunker appeared to sit lower than usual, similar to the SB3 Pacifics. It also made the SFs medium-range locomotives. The trailing wheels were very tiny at only 33 inches in diameter and supported so little weight because unlike most Santa Fe's, or in general, steam locomotives with trailing trucks, the firebox sat entirely behind the driving wheels and was supported entirely by the trailing truck. But on the SF-class Santa Fe's, the firebox sat on the rear driving wheels, which supported most of its weight, something that was more familiar and normal on most articulated steam locomotives as well. This is known as a conical boiler. Everything about the firebox was also small. The final unusual feature was the locomotive's 57-inch driving wheels, which were abnormally small for a US freight locomotive and undersized compared to 63 inches on the PM's Mikados. I will now show a comparison between the specs of the Pere Marquette SFs and USRA Light 210-2A from Thomas Dixon Jr.'s Pere Marquette Power. Upon their arrival, the SFs were assigned work on the Pere Marquette's main lines where bridge restrictions allowed, though apparently they were initially used on the Grand Rapids to Detroit, Toledo, Plymouth, and Saginaw, and Detroit to Saginaw main lines. The maximum tonnage allowed for these locomotives was just over 5,000 tons, from Mount Morris to Saginaw and from Plymouth to Detroit, Michigan. Other tonnage capabilities were 4,630 tons from Toledo to Plymouth, and their lowest allowed, 1,900 tons, which was on the 1.15% grade from Plymouth to South Lyon. By 1926, the Pere Marquette had strengthened the bridges on the line between Saginaw and Ludington, which gave the SFs more route availability as they could now operate through the car ferry port where they could be used in considerable overhead traffic across Lake Michigan. In the 1920s, the SFs, just like other Pere Marquette locomotives dating back to the 1900s, were cosmetically altered a bit. In their case, the old Sunbeam headlights were replaced with the Pere Marquette's more standard Pyle National-style headlights. This type of headlight was very common across America, and the Pere Marquette fleet was no exception. The SFs weren't fast, nor big for their type, but they were strong and got the job done, and were the largest locomotives on the Pere Marquette until 1930. In that year, the Pere Marquette purchased a pair of Santa Fe's that were larger than what they were already using. The locomotives in question were a pair of Hocking Valley F1s. They were originally built by Baldwin for the Lehigh Valley Railroad in 1919 as 4070 and 4073, and were two of 36 members of the company's second batch of their R1 class, numbered 4070 to 4075. Between 1920 and 1922, the two locomotives were among 16 Lehigh Valley R1s to be purchased by the Hocking Valley, who had them reclassed to F1s and renumbered to 140 and 143 respectively. When the Hocking Valley was absorbed into the Chesapeake and Ohio in 1930, 10 of their Santa Fe's, numbers 130 to 139, were inherited by the C&O, became their Class B1s, and renumbered to 2950 to 2959, while the rest, numbers 140 to 145, were sold off to the Lake Superior and Ishpeming Railroad, the Woodland Iron Company, and the Pere Marquette. 140 and 143 were sent to the Pere Marquette, who had them reclassed to SF-6 and renumbered to 1198 and 1199. The 6 in the classification and the skip to 9 in the road number's second to last digit was the PM's method of identifying them as being purchased from another railroad, just like how they also did for their ex-Erie Mikados. The SF-6s were 98 feet, 4.5 inches long overall and weighed 359 tons total. They had an adhesion factor of 3.94, a tractive effort of 71,450 pounds, 22 RA tenders with a fuel capacity of 18 tons of coal and 20,000 gallons of water, 100 square feet of grade area, almost 4,900 square feet of heating surface, 63-inch driving wheels, 29 by 32-inch cylinders, 205 psi boilers, piston valves with Walschaerts valve gear, and a DuPont B stoker. Compared to the United States Railroad Administration Heavy 210-2B, which I'm showing a comparison from the same book now, the SF-6s were larger and superior locomotives to them. The SF-6's biggest superiority was having a larger and wider firebox. This is because the Lehigh Valley had designed them to run out a low-quality coal called anthracite coal, so a lot of space was needed to burn it so that it could provide enough heat to the boiler. This was also the case with a more familiar example, the Reading T1s. The SF-6s were the most powerful locomotives in the PM's fleet and were more conventional in design than the SFs. They also had two sand domes placed side by side, an unusual detail for steam locomotives. Upon arriving on the Pere Marquette, the SF-6s were overhauled at the Wyoming, Michigan shops and had their rolled tenders replaced with larger 20 RA tenders supplied from Alco mentioned earlier. The 1198 and 1199 were assigned one each to the Wyoming and Saginaw terminals where they were used on the heaviest mainline trains. The dispatchers became familiar with loading the locomotive's trains to their full capacity, only to have them occupy the line for a long period of time, as, just like the SFs and other 210-2s, the SF-6s also had a low top speed. This meant that they were best suited to slow, heavy freight drags and not for all-around work. But when trucking competition began increasing and emphasis started shifting toward fast freights and overhead traffic in the late 1930s, the Pere Marquette needed a new locomotive that could pull heavier loads than their Mikados while being able to do so at a faster pace than their Santa Fe's, essentially combining the speed of the Mikados with the strength of the Santa Fe's. The result was the railway's iconic N range of Berkshires, which they began purchasing from Lima starting in 1937 and ending in 1944. The SF-6s were a bit stronger than the Berkshires but were slower, a bit shorter, and could still be outperformed in tractive effort by a Berkshire when its booster was engaged. Overall, the slight extra strength yielded little advantages, so it was evident that the Berkshires were the overall superior locomotives for the Pere Marquette's needs. Even when the Berkshires became the new queen of the Pere Marquette fleet, the SFs and SF-6s never went away. In 1937, the 1199 received a larger 22RD tender. Then in 1940, 9 of the SFs had their tenders rebuilt into larger 16RD tenders with a fuel capacity of 16,000 gallons and 18 tons. 1111 was fitted with a Worthington 4S feed water heater and was the only Pere Marquette 210-2 to have a feed water heater installed. Also in the 1940s, the SF and SF-6s air compressors were relocated from the left side of the boiler to the pilot beam for easier maintenance, and also giving them a more typical Pere Marquette appearance of the 1940s. As the Berkshires took over the Pere Marquette's fastest and heaviest freight trains, some of the SFs were relocated to the Waverly Engine Terminal and used as helper locomotives on Richmond Hill, while others were reassigned to New Buffalo where they were used on freight drags on the La Crosse branch and locals to Michigan City. The SF-6s soon replaced them on these jobs in the late 1940s, and both had stints as helpers on Richmond Hill. The SF-6s were also used occasionally on turnaround assignments out of Wyoming and New Buffalo. 2 stalls on the latter had to be extended with wooden sheds to accommodate these locomotives, and eventually the Berkshires. After the Pere Marquette was absorbed into the Chesapeake and Ohio in 1947, the 1198 and 1199 were reclassed to B1s and assigned numbers 2960 and 2961. This was the same class and number sequence as their 10 previously mentioned sister locomotives that were inherited by the C&O in 1930, with the ex-Pere Marquette engines continuing where they left off. But out of these two, only the 1198 was renumbered, while 1199 couldn't because it wasn't fully paid off, and the merger required that any equipment still not fully paid for had to retain its Pere Marquette livery and number. The SFs entered the Chesapeake and Ohio roster as the Class B4 and were renumbered to 2975 to 2989, with only 1103 and 1110 not being renumbered for the same reason as 1199. As was the case with any of the Chesapeake and Ohio's ex-Pere Marquette locomotives, the B1s and B4s didn't last very long. The former SF-6s, along with the other 10 B1s, were withdrawn in 1949 and scrapped later that year. Even the other Lehigh Valley Santa Fe's, as well as those owned by the Ellis and Nyar and Woodland Iron Company, were all cut up by presumably the mid-50s or early 1960s. The same fate struck all of the B4s, or former SFs, by 1952. The Santa Fe's may have been short on looks and slow, but they were an important part of the Pere Marquette's fleet until 1937, and even when displaced by the superior Berkshires, they still found work elsewhere, and their legacy lives on in the history book of the Pere Marquette Railroad, the railroad that gave us 1225, the real Polar Express.
Why, to the North Pole, of course! This is the Polar Express!
If you enjoyed the video or learned something nice, drop a like on it and subscribe to my channel to see more railroad-related content like this, and also to help support my channel. And if you're already subscribed, be sure to activate notifications so that you won't miss a future upload. I'm Andrew Raila, and stay tuned for the upcoming Berkshire episode this Christmas season. Thanks for watching.